right, Ed? Or you can just go like that if you need to.
Okay, I think we can get started now. We have a quorum. If you all haven't had enough time in chairs this weekend, welcome back. And for those of you who don't know, we had our town meeting yesterday that went from 9:30 until 6-ish. So we spent a lot of time on our behinds. Anyway, good afternoon all. I'm Tucker Smith from the Welcoming Committee, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here. We have a great group of speakers. This is the last of our 3 Sip Talk Learns that we've done this year, which has been our 5th year. So next year, we will schedule again for January, February, and March our Sip Talk Learns for season number 6. You all remember Victor Borge? Well, Victor Borge used to tell a great joke about Zsa Zsa Gabor's 7th husband. And he said, I know what I have to do, but I don't know how to make it more special. So I feel like I've told you the same spiel for 15 of these sessions over the 5 years. But I sort of like Zsa Zsa Gabor's husband. Anyway, for those of you, we even have visitors here today from Illinois. John Legates' family's here, so we're delighted to welcome them. You win the Out-of-Town Guest Award for coming the farthest. Sip Talk Learn started as a drinking game. Some of you have heard the story by graduate students in Canada, and we sort of decided drinking wasn't appropriate for a church, so we called it Sip Talk Learn. So that's where that all comes from. I'm asking that the speakers today, you all know your order, and if you can just give a brief introduction with your name so we all know who you are, and then you can give a little intro into your story if you like, and then Lucy, thankfully, is going to be our timer again, and when you have 1 minute left, she will hold up the 1 minute left sign, and then she will very kindly, delicately hang up, time is up. And we're pretty forgiving. We don't really cut you off right away. We give you a couple minutes or not a couple minutes, but a couple of seconds to finish your talk. And I also wanted to thank David, who is our AV guy today. We are on Altar Live for the first time, which is a much better platform for us than Zoom. And we're welcoming several people at home. And also thank you, RL, for doing he's given an introduction to the people at home. And so we're trying to incorporate them into today, too. So today we're going to start with Tricia Deck.
One quick note before Tricia starts. Afterwards, if you have a question, let me bring in the microphone because the people at home won't hear your question otherwise, okay? Thank you very much.
So once you're done, if you can open it up for questions.
Okay. Sounds good.
Talk right into the mic.
All right. So I'm Tricia Deck. As many people know, I'm an art quilter, but in another lifetime, I was a screen printer, and some of you may have known when I was in the schools printing with the kids. And I wanted to talk about how that screen printing company got started. First, I want to read a quote. This is from a website called Design is Fine, History is Mine. Imagine a time with no computers, but with lots of craftsmanship and creativity. That's pretty much where my company started, in the late 70s. My brother-in-law, Gary Fujiwara, and his friend, Peter Bradford, were graphic designers. Peter was in New York, and he was given a grant by Exxon to redo the Bronx Zoo subway stop. And he decided to do it with 4-foot by 6-foot posters of different animals at the zoo and information about all those animals. And so he approached Gary, and they approached me and said, hey, would you like to print these enormous posters for us? We will buy you all the equipment and materials, and if you print it for free, then you get all the equipment when you're done. So I said, sure, you know. So Mark helped me also with this. So the fun part of it was no computers. Peter and his students would create the art in New York, fill it up into a tube, put it on a Greyhound bus, and ship it to Boston. I would drive down from Manchester, pick it up, you know, we go back and we create the screens, and you know, they're 4 feet by 6 feet. So I would expose them in the basement, take the frames outside because we didn't have a sink big enough, wash out the image, and then bring them back and print them there. And at the end, then we would ship it all back by Greyhound bus to New York City. At the end of it, we actually had an opening at MoMA for the different exhibits, so technically my first art opening was at MoMA. But in preparation for this, I started Googling, because I've never seen, we're talking no computers back then, if there's any information on the internet. So Friday I Googled it, and up came 3 of the posters. And one was a gecko. We had 13 different. One was the tail, and one was the elephant, which is actually designed by my brother-in-law, Gary. And to my surprise, those 2 are in the Smithsonian. And so I'm going to reach out to them and see if I can get more information, because they said research in progress. So that's my story. So, anyway, any questions? Great. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Liz, married to Dave. So I'm going to tell a story. Dave suggested I do something that's kind of funny, because we've all been sitting in town meeting and lots of politics going on. So there are much more interesting things about me, but that's for another day. So freshman year of college, I had a really hard time making friends. I really struggled socially. So I signed myself up for a 30-day that summer, a 30-day NOLS course. Does anyone know NOLS, National Outdoor Leader School? Yeah. So it was 30 days in the Absaroka mountain range in Wyoming. And we carried all our food, and we were assigned to 4-person tent groups. And we would put our food in a big duffel bag every night and hang it in the trees to keep bears away. And a resupply would come in by horseback every 8 or 9 days with fresh supply of like powdered milk, oatmeal, pasta, all the things, because we were learning like how to make banana bread above tree line at altitude. And we got dried apricots, dried banana chips, you know, all the things that would last. So before 4 people would share this resupply for 8 or 9 days. And by the end, last resupply came, we had 4 days left, and we were assigned to another small group of 4 to do a walkout. So you had to use all your map skills, all your wilderness medicine skill to get yourself back down to Lander, to home base. So we're all excited to go that night, and one woman in our group, so I was like 19 or 20 at the time, there were 2 other 20-year-olds and then a 40-something woman. In the middle of the night, she has terrible pain in her stomach. She thought she was having an appendicitis. She couldn't stand up. She was groaning like when my neighbor was having a baby, it sounded like that. So one of us went over to our leader's tent. This was before cell phones. So one of them must have had a radio, so they called. And they sent a helicopter, which this was early 90s. It cost $1,000 to get emergency evac'd out on a helicopter. Now it's probably much more than that. Anyway, so she got taken out. We didn't know what happened. We finished our walkout. We all met down in Lander. She was there. And she said, you know, she looked great. And we were like, what happened? So turns out she's in the helicopter, moaning and groaning, thinks she's dying. And she gets down to the emergency room, and they put her on a gurney, and then they put her on a table, and they give her those warm towels. You know, they give you warm towels. She said she could finally relax. So she said it was seemed like 3-minute long, but it was probably 30 seconds to a minute, a really long fart. And the doctor was like, what have you been eating? And then she said, I felt great. So the doctor said, what have you been eating? And she said, well, I've been eating this and that. I've been on this course, you know, dried apricots. And he was like, how many dried apricots? And she said, well, I actually ate the whole bag. So it was a pound of dried apricots. So now Knowles, apparently it's like in their lore that when they're teaching you when you first arrive, that you need to ration your dried fruit so that you too don't fall prey to the $1,000 fart. Any questions?
I have to say that Liz texted me and said, "Do you think I can use the word?" And I said, "We've heard a whole lot worse recently, so thank you, Liz, that was great." Elaine.
Oh, yes. I'm Elaine Hawks. Is that too loud? Closer? If you listen to rock and roll music in the 1980s and you know my husband, then you might expect me to talk about my backstage adventures or the time I hung out in a jacuzzi with Bruce Springsteen, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. I am going to talk about a very brief but memorable interaction I had with someone in Lincoln who I barely knew about 15 years ago. When I was 8 years old, my father drove us all to a swampy spot between the hills in Weston, and he said this is where we were going to be swimming and boating the next year. We were joining a swimming club. And a year later, we were swimming and boating at the New Valley Pond. It was a great social place, and in those days, a lot of my friends lived in Browns Woods, and they walked down the hill to the pond from there. And we would hang out together and listen to our transistor radios and get tan. Then, when I had my own kids in the 1990s, I took them for their swimming lessons and boating at Valley Pond. Meanwhile, my friends had grown up and moved away, but I often saw their parents and they still lived in Browns Woods, and they walked down the hill to swim, and I would talk to them and find out how their kids were doing. And there was a gentleman who wasn't the parent of a friend, but he swam there frequently, and he was friendly, and we said hello. And I knew he was a Holocaust survivor because he had a tattooed number on his arm, which was both fascinating and horrifying to me. Later, when my kids were older, I would stop at the pond to swim on my way home from work to decompress. I worked in the geriatric department at McLean Hospital, and most of the people I worked with had severe depression that seemed to be related to their many losses and traumas. And I would see this same gentleman, but he no longer could walk down to the pond from Browns Woods. He would have been in his mid-80s by then, and he would drive over and get out of his car and put on these elbow crutches and make his way to the edge of the pond, where he cast off his crutches and enjoyed his swim. And then, when he got out, it was the same difficulty getting back to his car. But he always smiled and greeted me as we passed each other, and I was struck by how resilient he seemed to be. So one day, as I was passing him, I just told him that I was in awe of him and asked him how he did it. And he smiled at me and he said, "I only focus on what I can do and not on what I can't." And his answer just hit me like a brick, and I've thought about it from time to time since then, because we need to grieve our losses and we need to process our traumas as best we can, and we need to get support during our dark times. But in the end, we need to focus only on what we can do and not on what we can't. Any questions?
Yes, I'm Peter Pease, and I wanted to tell you today some stories about the two worst accidents in my life. And the thing about them, the big headline is, it always works out for the best in the end, always, which is something that one of my kids' best friends has a saying that he and their whole group of these 29-year-olds, that's their saying together, and I just love that. So my first one, I'm in my first year of law school. It's 1974 in the spring. This has been all the way through the first year, and I'm going to my final exam in constitutional law, and living in Newton, and every day taking a bicycle to Suffolk University and back and forth. And so I'm on my bike, and I just passed BU, and a truck goes and turns right onto me. And so I bounced off the side of the truck and smashed into the curb, and then up against the brick wall of a building. And I hit my head a little bit, but mostly I was able to defend myself with my hands. And I'm bleeding, and my bike, the wheel that hit the curb is just, and so I can't ride it anymore. So it's still pretty far from BU to Suffolk, but I'm carrying my bike, can't leave it there. I gotta keep my bike, and get up, and I get into the exam, and I go up to the professor at the front, and I say, "Professor, I had an accident. I'm 45 minutes late. Could I have any extra time?" "No." Okay, but I managed to finish the exam, and actually did okay. Got an 82 on it, and but it was a real pleasure to hand it in with blood all over the page, right? That it all worked out. Okay, so here's accident number 2. Was a few years earlier. I was working at the Long Wharf Theater in New Haven in a year between high school and going to college. And one night I was up with all of the actors and actresses celebrating after an opening night. Everybody was just so friendly and nice together. And so I was up late with them, and I decided, well, I'm going to drive back to my parents' house instead of being in New Haven. So I go up the highway there, and unfortunately, at like 5 a.m., I fell asleep, and I was in a VW Micro Bug, and I was driving along. I was going off the road and woke up, turned back, and then, there's a guardrail in the middle. Whacked into it, hit my head. Okay, I'm out in the car for, I don't know, half an hour. And then I get up and I get out of the car, and I'm standing there, and it's light out, and a VW bus comes driving up along the side of the road, and these people get out and come over to me, and they're hippies like me. And they say, "Are you okay?" Yeah, I'm okay. And they put me into their VW bus. Rusty is the guy, he's driving, and Love was her name, is sitting in the passenger seat, and she tucks me in between her legs. I'm on the floor, and she takes a pill and puts it in my mouth, and we drove off into forever. And everything works out. Yeah. The car sat there for a while until the police found it. And then, where's the person? Off climbing in the hills next to the road. But they were able to trace it to my family. And so they called up. And this was the saddest thing, because they went for a long time without knowing where I was. And they brought the family... They brought the family dog over there with some of my clothes, and so they were going up and trying to find me off in the hill, but I wasn't there because Rusty and Love took me to Yukon. And they put me in their room there, and I went to sleep, and then I got up, and then they were gone. So I went out and started walking, and I hitchhiked my way home. I did call my family, though, to tell them I was okay. But yeah, I did make it home.
That was Yukon College, not the Yukon.
That's now that would have been a trip, yeah.
Well, I'm Joan Mansfield, and as most of you know, I'm a retired doctor, and this is a story to illustrate the fact that your prefrontal cortex, where your judgment is not really connected to the rest of your brain until you're at least 25. I call this not the best bear story. It was 1974, and I just finished my first year in medical school. My classmates planned to spend the summer working in research labs. Well, I decided it was time for an adventure. I had a friend who'd moved to Kodiak Island off the coast of Alaska. We'd both done Outward Bound, and we planned a week-long kayak trip down a river on the backside of the island. In the fishing village on Kodiak, we loaded up our backpacks and 2 collapsible sea kayaks that she'd borrowed onto a float plane, and we headed for a salmon fishing cabin in the interior of the island where we'd begin our trip. We knew, of course, that Kodiak Island is famous for having the largest Alaskan brown bears around. On our first day, we headed out onto the lake to see the bears and to try out the kayaks. Several bears were fishing along the shore, and they were, indeed, very large, as advertised. And then we noticed that our kayaks were beginning to leak. In fact, the kayaks were gradually filling with water. We paddled back to our cabin. It turned out that the kayaks had spent the previous winter abandoned on the ice and had rotted. So it was time for a new plan. Somewhere during all this, my friend sprained her ankle badly, and she couldn't walk. So we called the float plane to come pick us up, but it would take 3 days to get to us. Our new friends from the Fish and Game cabin invited us to a ptarmigan dinner to pass the time. The cabin was a quarter of a mile away, down a bear trail, through some shoulder-high brush. All the trails in the area were made by bears. We started out down the bear trail toward the Fish and Game cabin. I walked, and my friend crawled behind me. As we neared the cabin, I saw a large bear crossing the salmon weir over the river. The bear was about to reach the T intersection with our trail and either turned toward us or away. My friend was unaware of the unfolding drama. This was before the days of bear spray, but we've been told that it's best to make your presence known to the bear. So I started to sing, "The ants come marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah." The bear stopped. He stood on his hind legs, trying to figure out what was making all the noise. Bears don't have very good eyesight, but their hearing is just fine, and apparently he found my singing not to his liking. He turned and headed down the trail away from us. We had a very fine ptarmigan dinner and walked or crawled our way back to the cabin that evening. I've since been instructed how more properly to deal with threatening grizzlies. On a recent trip to Glacier National Park, the ranger explained to us that if the bear is really about to aggressively charge, it may yawn, clack its teeth, and pound its front paws. In that case, the ranger said, "Please stay calm and make a tight circle around me."
These are all really tough acts to follow. I'm very nervous, and I'm terrified of that sign. Oh, God. So I'm going to read. I'm going to follow Bruce Newman's words this morning about reading so you don't go over time. So this is a story from the summer of 1970. So although my story I share today is 54 years old, I am constantly reminded of the experience I had in 1970 when, as a 16-year-old, I worked on a 2-month building project in Jamaica with Operations Crossroads Africa. I was one of 8 volunteers who were part of OCA's first foray into the Caribbean, so it was new for the organization and the volunteers. So just a bit of a background on OCA, I don't know if any of you know of it, but it was created in 1958 by Reverend James Robinson, an African-American minister with deep commitment to social justice. And he'd had a tour of African countries in 1954, and that convinced him that the most effective way to help struggling communities was through hands-on practical aid. And it was the success of the first projects in Ghana and Liberia that inspired President Kennedy to establish the Peace Corps. So, to my story. An important part of the philosophy of how OCA puts project teams together is to mix students from all socioeconomic backgrounds and races from across the US. For the 3-day orientation in New York City, my roommate was an African-American girl from Harlem, and while we got along just fine, it was pretty clear our worlds were miles apart. On the last night, she invited her much older boyfriend and 2 of his friends from Harlem to our room, and the 3 of them proceeded to shoot heroin. So these were the wild days of the 60s, and Woodstock had been the summer before, but I was not braced for heroin. I thought, LSD, sure, but not that. So, Peter, you would have maybe fit right in there, I'm not sure. So I did consider myself wildly and worldly, wise and worldly, but not. So I'm quite sure Reverend Robinson did not have this in mind when he thought of cross-cultural experiences, and I doubt my parents did either, and they didn't find out. So our project was to build a one-room schoolhouse in the village of Nakalva, a tiny remote village in the Blue Mountains, accessible only by train and then by dirt road. Due to a delay in the shipment of materials, the 8 of us were each assigned interim projects in Kingston, which at the time was the focus of the Black Panthers looking to bring, oh, there's that scary thing, bring their message to the Caribbean. It was not a great place to be white at that time. I had to take a bus to get to the orphanage I'd been assigned to and was often spat on and pushed to the back of the bus and jeered. The orphanage wasn't that much better. It was run by 2 old white racist British spinster sisters who took out their frustrations in life on the children in their care. They were straight out of Charles Dickens. Ruling by the rod was the norm, and that rod was taken to me once. This woman was this big, and she comes at me with this rod. And all I had done was help one of the children with their chores. Apparently, what I thought was an act of kindness was considered detrimental to character development. So I left the orphanage after 10 days feeling horribly guilty that I got to escape, but relieved to be away from the 2 demons at its helm. We boarded the train in Kingston and headed north into the Blue Mountains. After 2 hours, we came to a stop in what was literally the middle of the jungle. Is that meaning I'm done? Oh. I just have to finish this. A handwritten sign naming the town was our only indication we had arrived. Out we got and were met by several people from the village with a donkey cart to carry our bags. The population of about 80 people lived in houses that were simple huts made of concrete bricks on dirt floors, with corrugated tin roofs and windows with screens made of spider webs. That was very scary. The 8 of us lived in a dorm in a rustic rundown building that had once housed slaves, built during a time when the sugarcane plantation owners thought of harvesting bananas and avocados in the region there. After my experience in Kingston, I was prepared for the worst, but herein lies the reason for my story. I get to it finally. It was the first and sadly the last time in my life that skin color made absolutely no difference. The majority of those living in Nakalva had never been far from the town. There were no televisions in the village, but they did have radios and heard of the conflicts and violence in Kingston. We were asked constantly what it was like in the city. Did blacks and whites really hate each other? And why did they hate each other? At that time, the tourist areas in the north of Kingston were far removed in every sense from the mountains and the south where Kingston was. Bauxite and sugarcane were major industries, but the town of Nakalva was too remote for even those industries, for them to feel the impact of those industries. I've never been back, but I know the town is still small, far less remote with road construction, and it has been swept up into the modern world with the advances of technology over the last 54 years. I'm sure that color indifference I felt is gone. I did go over, sorry. Any questions?
I think we're all questioned out after yesterday. So.
Hello, everyone. My name's Sarah Klukowski. I'm the ministry associate here, and I'm going to tell a story that really shaped who I am and what is important to me. So, you can go ahead. Some of you may know I shared recently that I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. My grandparents are Polish and Ukrainian, were Polish and Ukrainian and Catholics, and were brought into a concentration camp, and I don't know how long they were there. I do know that after they got out at the end of the war, they got married and had my father, and then immigrated to the United States in 1950 when my dad was 4 years old. I grew up seeing a lot of the impact of the Holocaust on my family, seeing the impact on my babcia. I never knew my zhazhu, and also on my father. but there were so many questions that I had. I didn't really know a lot about what happened to them and what the conditions were, and I would try and get answers, but it's tough to talk about, of course. And so I always had to do my own research and tried to understand what happened and what the Holocaust was on my own, because I could see the impacts, but I didn't have the details. And so when I was in high school, and my high school history teacher told me that there are folks that say that the Holocaust didn't happen, and she wanted to start a Holocaust remembrance project so that we could understand and do some extracurricular work learning about it. I said, yes, please. I need to know as much as I can possibly know. So we stayed after school and we watched the documentaries, and we saw the footage of the concentration camps. We saw the mass graves. We saw what happened. And so another part of the work that we did together was interview Holocaust survivors. And so we were able to meet with a lot of folks that were imprisoned in the concentration camp in Terezin. And we ended up doing a documentary. We put together some recordings of those interviews that we had with them. And they all told us about a man named Raphael Schechter, who was imprisoned in that concentration camp with them. He was a composer and director of music. And so he, as part of his resistance to the Nazis, organized a male choir, and then he would sneak over to the women's barracks and organized a women's choir. Eventually, the genders were integrated, and he organized a cohort of folks from the whole camp. And they ended up doing a whole series of performances of Verdi's Requiem. And that was, for the folks that we heard their stories from, a big part of what gave them strength day to day to go and sing together. And the last performance of Verdi's Requiem was actually a propaganda piece. The Nazis invited a bunch of people from the Red Cross to come and listen to this incredible music as a way to show how it's not that bad in here. But the folks that were singing said that in part of the Requiem is, you're singing to folks saying, you're going to get yours one day, that God's going to judge you. And so they felt, even though they knew what they were doing was propaganda, they felt that there was empowerment for them through that. And we learned that Raphael Schechter didn't have any sort of memorial to him. And so we went to I know I'm out of time, I'm sorry. We went down to the Holocaust Museum in DC as part of our capstone project, and presented our documentary to them. And we asked them if they would add Raphael Schechter to their permanent exhibit. And that's not something that they do. But they said yes. And so now Raphael Schechter is memorialized in that way and honored for the way that he organized his community to resist oppression. And it's part of, for me, why I hold the core values that I do, and why, for me, in order for never again to mean anything at all, it has to mean never again for anyone. Thank you. Any questions? Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Hi. RL, can you hear me okay? Hi, my name's Mike Killick. Many of you are my old friends. I have new friends sitting in front of me as well, I'm sure. So I also, like Liz, opted to tell a funny story, but it's something that actually happened. This is my new home, but it's not my birth home, as you can probably tell. And I miss a few things about the UK where I grew up. Long summer nights where it's still light at 10 o'clock at night, ridiculing the French and expecting ridicule in return. And also, the great British sense of humor. And one British man did say something funny to me once, and that's what I want to talk about. So I met my wife on the 4th of December, 1998. It was love at first sight. We had a whirlwind weekend, and then she went back to London, where she was living, from New York, where we'd met. I arranged to meet her the following weekend, so I flew out there on Friday morning, and I was very nervous. It was a big deal to me, so what to wear? So I went to Covent Garden, and in my nervousness, looking for something to protect my frail heart, I bought this long Neo from the Matrix black leather coat. Went all the way to the floor. We met that evening in a large group of friends. We embraced. Our feelings were unchanged. It was wonderful. Somehow I ended up in her house the following morning, and I had to get back to my friends where I was staying for the weekend. They lived in Shepherd's Bush. The traffic around the BBC is awful. Where the Shepherd's Bush is where the BBC headquarters are. And I got off the subway, and I'm running down the street, Uxbridge Road. There's traffic, bumper to bumper on both sides. So for whatever reason, filled with joy, I'm running down the median, down the middle of the road. And in the UK, the fastest vehicles in Europe are actually plumbers' vans. They are vans with 6-foot storage spaces with 12-foot pipes in, and there's always a blue rag tied to the end of the copper pipe. And no matter how fast you're going on the freeway, you will always be overtaken by a plumber's van with smoke, cigarette smoke billowing out of it. So I'm approaching a plumber's van, running, my heart filled with joy as fast as I can, so I can get my stuff and go back to Sarah's house. And as I'm approaching this plumber's van, sure enough, there's a plumber in the driver's seat, and he's smoking appropriately, as he should be. The window's down, it's a hot summer's day, I'm gonna make it. It's a hot summer's day, he has a casually leaning on the driver's side window and watching me, and I can see him watching me. I know he's watching me. He knows I know that he's watching. And as I approach, he's got something to say, and I know it's coming, and I come up, and I run up to this van. I was like, oh my God, what's it going to be? And he goes, Gotham City's that way, mate.
Well, I'm Ken Hurd, and I'm going to tell you another sailor's yarn. I told one a couple of years ago, and the fact that Tucker actually remembered it is the reason I'm telling you another one. The last one was how I sailed the coast of Maine. This one is when 5 fraternity brothers and I decided it would be a great idea to sail from Florida to Nassau, because well, what could be better? We'll sail to Nassau and we'll meet chicks, right? I will leave it to you all to decide whether this is funny, this is humorous, or whether it's tragic. So just to begin, my father taught people at the Power Squadron, for the Power Squadron. So before we left on this trip, there were only 2 of us who actually knew how to sail of this crew of 6. And I wanted a refresher course in dead reckoning, which is where you figure tides and winds and all this business and speed to figure out where you will be at what point in time. And anyway, the trip begins. Now you can start. Oh. The trip began at Cornell. Imagine 6 guys in a Plymouth or something driving down from Cornell. We went to my parents' home in Delaware, had dinner, and then continued the drive to Florida. And we got there the next morning or something. And it turns out that the charter company made this classic mistake that you never do back-to-back charters because you don't know what the weather's going to be like. And so, sure enough, the previous charter didn't get their boat back to Florida in time. So he had to fly us all to Bimini, which is where the boat was. It's only like 25 miles away, but you know, it's some little Piper Cub or something. And we got there and had a little orientation and so forth. And I'd sailed enough to know that stuff happens on a cruise. But as long as I knew how the boat worked and so forth, I was comfortable. My friend grew up sailing Navy yawls in Annapolis. So the two of us were experienced. We set off, and the winds were against us, and we had about 75 miles, I think, to go to Nassau. And we were not going to make it in one day. But with dead reckoning, I said, well, we'll reach the edge of the continental shelf at about 1 o'clock in the morning. And if I've done this right, there'll be a buoy that marks the edge. And when I went to sleep, it made everybody nervous. We did arrive at the buoy at about 1 o'clock in the morning, dropped anchor because it was still only maybe 16 feet deep. And of course, the continental shelf is where the sharks come up and feed on other fish. So we didn't want to be there in the night and so forth. Anyway, the next day, the engine didn't start. No matter. We'll sail off the anchor. We'll be in Nassau, well, with a little luck, by mid-afternoon. Well, that didn't happen. We got there at about 5 o'clock. The sun was setting, and it turns out we misjudged something, and we were on the inside of the breakwater rather than the outside to approach the harbor. I'm not going to make it, Lucy.
Yes, you can.
And as we came in, everybody's waving at us. Oh, look at that. That's so beautiful. This boat's sailing up into the harbor. We thought, well, that's pretty cool. We'll like that. Well, anyway, we had no charts. We didn't know anything about the Nassau harbor. And as we came in, I told everybody, here's what we're going to do. We're going to come into the main harbor, come into the wind. We're going to drop the main. And then with the jib, and I've done this many times, with the jib, we're going to come around, and we're just going to arrive at the dock. It's going to be very simple. What happened? Well, there's an unmarked reef in Nassau Harbor. Well, actually, there's a pipe. But in the dusk, it's hard to see. So we came up, and I said, let's drop the main, and then we'll fall off to pick up the wind. What's that pipe? It's right next to... We're aground on a reef. What do we do? My friend from Annapolis said, well, here's what we do. There's what's called a topping lift, goes from the top of the mast to the end of the boom. I'm going to get on the end of the boom. I'm going to swing out, and that unweights the boat, and then we will drift off. So he did that. And at that point, the topping lift broke. He and the boom went into the water, where the pipe is still there. And of course, the harbor master, must happen all the time. They sent a launch out to get us. So we haul him in and the boom in, and they get us off. And we find that when we get to the dock, we find that the cable that pulls up the centerboard, which it had, didn't have the proper fitting. It was just the cable wrapped through a loop in the steel centerboard, and so it had frayed, and now the centerboard was just dangling like this on the bottom. So we couldn't lift it or control it or anything. Anyway, we sat at the dock for 3 days, getting repairs, fixing the cable, fixing the engine, repairing the topping lift, and we never met any women at all. So you tell me if this was a good story, a humorous story, or a tragedy.
Remind me never to go sailing with you.
Oh, I have many more stories.
Larry.
I've been listening to these stories, and I think I forgot what I came here for. So about a year ago, I was here telling a story concerning a life and death experience that I had in the cold waters of the Sound of Maine. And that was one of 4 life or death stories that I've experienced to date. Very briefly, this is just by way of intro. Very briefly, that story concerned sailing single-handedly in the Gulf of Maine in late September. And I was sitting in the cockpit when suddenly and unexpectedly the boom of the boat swung violently across the cockpit, swept me out of the cockpit, deposited me into the shockingly cold water of Maine. And when I bobbed to the surface, the boat was smartly under sail because I had basically cleated the main sheet. And so that story concerned making a life or death decision under extreme duress. As you can see, I'm still here. So, and just by happenstance, Ken's story was the site of one of my life or death experiences outside the breakwater at Nassau. But I hadn't planned on telling that today. I'll save that for another time. So I think I'll talk. By the way, the story that I told about a year ago occurred when I was in my mid-60s. And I've considered every year since then basically a bonus year. So I've had 20 bonus years since then. And the stories, the other life and death stories basically don't concern decision making under duress, but they do concern unique twists of fate. And so I think I'll probably tell the one that first occurred when I was in my mid-20s. There were 3 of us, an astrophysicist from MIT and 2 law students, and all good friends. We decided to go duck hunting over Christmas break. The site was Merry Meeting Bay, which is just inside the Maine coast off of Brunswick and Bath. And it's an estuary. So we rented a little cabin on the side of Merry Meeting Bay, arrived 3 of us in a lab, black lab, made ourselves at home, and there was a, as I remember, there was a big stone fireplace with a big hearth. We got a roaring fire going and pulled the chairs in sort of a semicircle in front of the hearth and started telling stories late into the night in front of this roaring fire. And I remember the lab lying there, his eyes slowly opening and closing as these stories continued well into the night. And the next morning rolled around, and we went outside, and I can still sort of feel it to this day. There was a light snow falling, sort of caressing our cheeks. It was very soft and extremely quiet, and the visibility was okay. So we hopped into the boat, 3 of us and the lab, and rowed out into Merry Meeting Bay. The tide was just right. There were these exposed mud flats, and it's a vast bay. So we chose to come to rest on a very large mud flat, pulled the boat up, got out, and started slogging toward the far end of this flat where we thought we had heard some ducks. And we finally got to the end of the flat, and what turned out to be what we thought were ducks were actually geese. So we decided, well, maybe we can use these geese as decoys, and let's not disturb them. Let's move around them and set up sort of on the other side of the flat. So we did, and it was sort of a desultory experience. There wasn't much happening. The snow was intensifying a little bit, and after quite some time, we decided it was time to try some other spot. So we started slogging back to where we had left the boat, and we slogged and slogged. And you want me to stop? Oh, okay, okay. And we couldn't find the boat. I mean, we thought we had left it here, and it wasn't where we thought we had pulled it up. And then finally we looked at each other and said, you secured the boat? You secured the boat? And there was no response. So we then looked at one another, and there was just sort of a stony silence. And we realized that here we were on this mud flat with a rising tide. The snow was intensifying. There was not another living soul within eyesight or shouting distance. And we began to realize the predicament of our peril. So we finally broke the silence. There was no recriminations. The conversation began, well, you remember when we were at the far end of the flat, there were those geese. And opposite the geese, there was that little sort of island with a stony neck and some trees. And we thought that island was across a deep water channel from the flat. So we agreed, let's try to seek refuge there. And now the storm had intensified to the point where the visibility was maybe 15 or 20 yards. So we had no idea exactly which direction to go. And we started off nonetheless, and the water was rising. It was probably maybe reaching above the ankles to the bottom of the calves. And there was grass on the flat, which was bent over, which told us that we were still on the flat. If the grass had been straight, we thought we were getting into deeper water. So we hewed to the bent grass, and after a while, we realized we were totally lost. So then we consulted again. That's a plan. So one of us took one of our shotguns, loaded it, and fired 2 shots into the air. And oh my God, the geese started cackling. We knew where they were. And we said to the dog, fetch. The dog took off. We followed the dog as best we could in the direction which we heard the geese. And eventually out of the mist appeared this little island with sort of the gooseneck of rocks on it. And there was a deep water channel between us and the island. One of us was 6'1", another was 5'10", and another was 6. So we laid our plans. The 6'1" would try the channel first, followed by the 5'10", followed by the 6-footer. And we were all prepared to rescue one another. We had our waders on. We didn't know what to expect. But anyway, the 6'1"er went in first to the deep channel, and the water was just about chest deep for him. And so the 5'10"er went in, and we knew he was going to get considerably wet. And then the 6-footer followed, and we had our shotgun above our head in one hand and the ammunition in the other, and the dog was swimming. And the deep water channel was probably 10 to 15 yards wide, and we waded across that successfully without any mishaps, got to the other side, and the water, of course, had seeped in. We had cinched our wading belts as tight as we could so we could barely breathe, but the water nonetheless seeped down through our wet woolen shirts, long underwear, into the bottom of our waders, and it was frigid. Our teeth were definitely chattering at that point, and so I think we took off, as I recall, I think we took off those waders, emptied them out once we got to the island, put them back on, and then at that point we said, okay, it's time to reconnoiter where we are, and we decided to break up into two groups. Two of us went on the west side of the island and one on the east side with the dog, and so we started to reconnoiter the island, and the two of us sort of got halfway along the east side when all of a sudden we heard this muffled sound coming from the other side of the island. And so we scrambled as best we could across the island. And as we got over to the other side, the point where we had some visibility to the shoreline, it was the most improbable sight. Here we were in the middle of this vast bay with it heavily snowing. There were just a few islands, and there was the boat. It had drifted remarkably up against the shore of the west side of the island. So that's the unique twist of fate.
You win the Fickle Finger of Fate award. My goodness.
Let me just say, it's lucky I'm not the moderator of this meeting.
We couldn't stop that midway. So, Steve, you don't want to do an impromptu one, do you? We have a little time.
Well, I'll try to overcome
Nothing like putting you on the spot.
try to overcome my natural shyness, of course.
Yes.
This is actually retribution because last time I had. Apologies, Steve. That's okay. But I haven't told you what the story's about yet. I was signed up for the last event, and 4 days before it, I decided to take my 89-year-old mother to New Zealand. So I bailed out last time. So this is retribution for my not being here. And I'm told one should never read, but I'm going to just take advantage of the notes. Okay. My name is Steve Cropper, and I have the pleasure of living in Sarah and Larry's compound down the road. And I've been here for about 5 years. How long have I been here, Sarah? And I noticed that the first time I came to First Parish here, there were maybe 60 people in attendance, and 5 of them came up after the sermon and said, "Is your father John Cropper? I worked for him. Did you work for the AMC?" There were 5 different people who I had a connection with in my first visit to First Parish, which I think was an extraordinary number of connections. So I'm in the Dominican Republic, and I'm going through security leaving, and I have this wallet with me. And you see it has a 1900 silver dollar that my grandfather gave me. And when I'm going through metal detectors, I hold on to my money and I hold on to the cell phone because I figured with those two and also with a passport, you can do anything nowadays, right? Wallet, cell phone, passport. So I was holding on to this, and I'm going through security, and I'm just right at the metal detector. I'm just about to go through the metal detector, and a really skinny, local TSA person comes up to me, and wants to look in the wallet that I'm holding, protecting it from theft. And the look on her face sounded an alarm. When you've been around long enough and you look at something, something's fishy, something. But sometimes you're smart enough to recognize it. Other time it just sort of seeps in, and your body reacts to it. So she waved me through the metal detector, and of course the metal detector was set off by the coin. And on the other side was another skinny local TSA person. And the look in his eye looked dangerous. And it started making me think of how I feel when you walk down the street and a dog is looking at you aggressively. When the dog looks at you aggressively, I've gotten good at like looking back at it. It's like, don't you dare, and usually it works. But I figured I'm in their country and I'm on the wrong side of security. I'm not out yet, so that would be a little risky. And the silver dollar was catching their attention. So the TSA person comes up to me and I'm thinking, okay, he's on the leaving the countryside. I'm not out yet. I pass them my wallet, but not my passport, holding onto the passport. And the wallet's thick. And in here I've got like 5 different business cards in addition to my regular ones, which if you open them up, you'd think, well, this would make a good CIA story because he's got one with the same name, mind you, but one's about Africa and one's about this and one's about that. So different stories, which reminds me of walking through Rock Creek Park in DC once with a little tote bag that I got after I gave a lecture to the CIA and thinking that would be great. I get murdered for something. I'm really not a spook. And I get murdered because I happen to be carrying a CIA bag and somebody figures there's a story here. Democrat gets murdered and so I'm watching the TSA duo and something is fishy. The young man wants my money clip. I open it up. You know, it has a little bit of money in there. And he looks at me and he starts counting the money. So I had to give him the wallet, but I'm looking right at him in the wallet, not looking around, just looking right at him. And I'm thinking of Colonel Thomas M. Gray, my grandfather, gave me this, you know, World War II veteran. And so I'm starting to feel murderous because they're touching this silver dollar, which is mine, and I don't know what's going to happen. And before I went, I brought more money than usual because it feels like it might make sense to have sort of walking around money in a third world country in case something happens. And time at this point is moving very slowly. This entire story takes place in about 30 seconds. And at this moment, I've only got 1 minute to take 30 seconds. So up till now, there have been no words from either party. I hadn't said anything, they hadn't said anything. And all of a sudden, all these movies happen, are coming through my head, where I'm in Africa and it's 2 a.m. and I'm coming up to a border crossing and there's just me and the border guards and there's nobody else around and there's no civilization, they make the rules. And then the man said to me, $10. And I gave him a look, that murderous dog look. And I have my police sheriff's ID in here, but he didn't notice that because it was in English. And I gave him that, again, the aggressive, if you were a dog, I was going to break your neck look, but it wasn't working. And then I noticed behind me, people were starting to back up. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe this will help me because the tourists were starting to back up. And I just kept looking at them and looking until finally I took the wallet from his hand with some trepidation. Again, not my country, third world. And I took it back and I looked at them, kept them both in the eye. And then I just kept walking. And later, I regret I would like to have said, okay, I'm going to give you both, 30 seconds. You're on camera. In a minute, I'm going to yell that they're stealing from my wallet. And if you want, you can leave the airport before I do that, but I'll give you 30 seconds. But I'm not that quick thinking. Anyway, so I did not part with my money, but it was anxiety-provoking, being in the third world, not being sure who was in charge, and trying to think quickly. So thank you for listening. And I recommend a trip to the Dominican Republic, but beware of the TSA, or their version of the TSA.
Any spontaneous storytellers? Then I guess we will close for the 5th year and welcome you back next January. And thank you so much for coming. It's always aren't these stories just phenomenal? I mean, every single one has been great. And Nate, thank you for taking time on a Sunday afternoon to be here. That's very special. And please help yourself to any refreshments, and we'll see you around. Thanks.